Okay, are we waiting for anybody else?
Micah said she would join when she got back. She had a meeting in town for a resident, so she will be here when she gets here.
Okay, that works. And are we waiting for anybody else?
No, ma'am, you can go ahead and start.
Okay, you guys have had a training morning, huh?
I don't know if you know, Barbara, but we pretty much always have crazy mornings around here because we have kids.
I gather. Okay. You can see the screen, yes? You can see the slides?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, here's what we're going to do today. We've already done this down on the Enterprise campus, but we had to kind of reschedule you guys. I know you've had a lot of stuff going on. So one of the things a couple of years ago, you know that the Enterprise campus had a really, really bad year. They had Mike Ellis passed away after an altercation with a youth. And then the two youth who ran and tried to shoot at the police. And it created a lot of havoc on the campus, as you can imagine. And it created what we could best describe as PTSD amongst some of the staff. So at the time, I remember saying to Kitwana and Kevin and a few other people, because this was 2 years ago. And for those of you who don't know, I'm not over on the main campus and I'm not over there very often. Our office at Circle of Friends is about 3 miles away. And we pretty much operate separately, but at the time I did tell them that if any of the staff wanted to come over and talk to me, that it would not be me opening them for therapy, but just allowing them to talk about what happened, because it was pretty rough. And Mike essentially did die in front of some of the people that were working that night. And then the other incident brought a lot of very bad press that has not 100% died down. And the television cameras were parked outside the gates, and it was a very bad thing for a long time. But at the end of all this, I had suggested to them that they implement something called critical incident stress debriefing. Because it's very, very hard to deal with the stuff that you guys probably deal with on a daily basis and still take care of yourselves. So there's a model, it's a NOVA model, it's called critical incident stress debriefing. And it's used by first responders and it's used for first responders. And it's essentially to allow people to debrief after something terrible happens. In the case of Mike dying, and in the case of the situation with the kids who ran off campus and attempted to shoot at the policeman, they did not do critical incident stress debriefings, and they didn't offer them to the staff. And it was concerning. I think there were so many other things going on that it just got kind of plowed under. But after that, we did talk about the fact that, number one, you guys would be considered first responders because you are the ones that are with your kids. You're the ones that are involved with the situations, and you're in Madison, so you're not anywhere near some of the resources that maybe the Enterprise people have. So we're going to talk a little bit about what happens to people during crises and how you can, number one, respond as first responders and be treated for some of the stuff that happens if you should need to do it. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. And I don't know how many of you consider yourself first responders, but with all the stuff that happens with the kids, with the staff, I know you've had some weird things happening with your staff. You as the frontline people have got to absorb what's going on inside yourself, and you've got to take care of everybody else. So we're going to talk about what happens to your brain during a crisis, because it happens to everybody's brain. It's nothing that we choose. the fight, flight, or freeze syndrome is nothing that we choose. It's what happens to our brains organically. And it happens to the lowest form of mammal. That's why possums play dead. That's why you see, I was watching out my window yesterday at a squirrel that was obviously being stalked by something, and he just stood up and stood there and froze for a number of minutes. It's just, it happens to all of us and to all levels of animal. So we're going to talk about fight, flight, or freeze. Interesting that you're doing teaching family, because some of this does dovetail with this. If you have a kid that is in full-blown 5-alarm fire, and that kid is in fight mode, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good to say, calm down. There's something that happens to the brain when these kids go off, when you go off, and that's what we're going to look at today. The whole run, hide, fight thing is the variation that has been adapted for school violence situations. I've noticed in recent months that some of that has been modified, that run, hide, fight is another form of fight, flight, freeze. I think we know from watching school violence incidents that the people who most often are killed in school shooting situations are the people that are in some form trying to fight. That your best option in any situation like that is to run or to hide. The school guidance counselors, the gym teacher at Parkland, the principal at Newtown, were all people that were running and trying to fight, and they were all killed. So we're going to look at the best options for you to handle crisis situations. And we're going to talk about the role of a crisis counselor, because you do not need to be a therapist to be a crisis counselor. You need to understand what a critical incident stress debriefing is, so you can use it if you need to use it. And we have used it. We have used it here. I have used it. I used it on the main campus. I think it was 5 years ago. I don't know if any of you were here when Justin Hagel died he was a young childcare worker. He was 24. He died in a pretty tragic accident, had a head injury. He was on a skateboard and he hit a bump and came down and hit his head. I employed the critical incident stress debriefing for the staff after that incident, not for any other reason. The fact that I was there to do a training, and when they all walked in, he had just died the night before, and these people were in no shape to do anything. And it was pretty quickly recognized that they were in no shape to do anything. So I said, okay, we're not going to do a training today. This is what we're going to do. And we kind of went through the steps of a critical incident stress debriefing. So that's what I want you guys to be looking at today. I want you to recognize that it's just a 4-step model. And if you use it, and you can use it in a lot of situations, you can use it with your kids, you can use it with each other. And I guarantee it will help everybody kind of calm down and focus on what has to happen now. So, and again, if you guys want to say anything, all you have to do is turn off your mic and join in. It's much easier for me if you do. So we see a lot of crises now, don't we? I mean, we've seen a ton of crises since the beginning of 2023. I forget when I last clocked this, how many mass shooting incidents had occurred in the United States. They seem to happen on almost a daily basis now. The day that I was putting together this particular training, I was sitting here in my office putting this whole PowerPoint together, and it got to be about 4:45, and I was getting ready to go home, and I thought, well, let me just see what's happening on the news. Well, I turned on the news, and it was the day of the Uvalde shooting. And at that point, that had happened maybe a couple of hours before, and the news was all over the place. One of the news articles said 1 shot, another one said 2 shot. Nobody killed, 3 injured. It just, the news was just kind of evolving to the point where you really couldn't tell what had happened, except that something had happened. And at this point, I don't even know if we would say that these things are unexpected, because they're not unexpected. That's why we have a whole protocol that we use at Circle of Friends around accepting potential school shooters, because they are expected and they've become kind of predictable at this point. But we typically look at a crisis as something that is overwhelming, that you can't change. People that go into crisis mode are often confused. They're often in shock. They don't remember things clearly. If you're talking to one of your kids or one of your staff that maybe has just gone through something, a traffic accident, a loss, something, they may not at all remember what you said the next day. And you may be sitting there talking to them and thinking, well, they're certainly right with me, and they're not there at all. So I want to show you this picture. This is a pretty famous picture. This is the picture of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And I know that a lot of you are fairly young and may not ever have seen this picture, but this was taken seconds after President Kennedy was shot. And it's a little hard to see, but this is Governor Connolly. I can get my mouth to work here. This is Governor Connolly was in the front seat, and he was injured, but he was not killed. And this is John Kennedy right here. He was shot obviously in the head, but what I want you to look at is Jackie Kennedy. What is Jackie Kennedy doing? Has anybody seen this picture before? It's a pretty iconic picture.
I didn't see the picture. I saw a clip of when it happened on YouTube, I think. A friend of mine pulled it up because she was a teacher and it was a whole thing, so we were talking about it. And so I saw the video of when it happened.
Okay. So what do you think she was doing? If you saw the whole video, you know that she crawled onto the back of the motorcade. You got to also remember, this is 1963. We don't do this kind of stuff anymore. That route was publicized in the Dallas News for days before it happened. Everybody knew exactly where that motorcade was going to be at each point along the motorcade route. They were in an open convertible, and 2 cars behind was Vice President Johnson in an open convertible. So there was no protection for any of these people. You can see that the 2 drivers here obviously know something happened, but Alexa, if you saw the video, what did you think she was doing?
Initially, I thought she was trying to run, like get away. And my friend was saying she was like grabbing fragment. Yeah, she was. You know, it's a very, very sad picture, but it perfectly explains what happens to somebody during a crisis. And thank you for that. These poor guys on the motorcycles were the Secret Service, who had to quickly try to figure out what had happened. This guy over in the corner had to get up on the motorcade in the back of the car and push her back into the seat, because at that point, nobody knew what was going on. This guy retired a few years ago, but he has gone on the lecture circuit, and he said he had severe PTSD for years after this happened. Remember, it's their job to protect the president. Their job is to protect the president from being hurt. At this point, John F. Kennedy was dead, but Mrs. Kennedy had no memory of this after it happened. It really did look like she was trying to flee. She tried to tell somebody incoherently after it happened that she was reaching for his brain, because the bullet hit him in the back of the head and blew off a portion of his brain, and it flew onto the back, and she was climbing onto it trying to get that portion of his brain. Now, what would that have accomplished? Absolutely nothing, but she wasn't thinking clearly. And the Secret Service climbed up on the car to get her back in there because they thought she was trying to climb out of the car. To be truthful, I don't think she knows what she was trying to do, but it is a perfect example of what happens when somebody goes into crisis. You know how we talk about your thinking brain? When you're in a crisis, your thinking brain, this prefrontal cortex here, goes completely offline. All you're operating on is your trauma center. You're operating on the amygdala in the back of your head. You're not thinking clearly. You're not processing clearly. If you think of anything that's happened to you in your history that was extremely traumatic, maybe it was the death of someone, maybe it was the day that you came home and found out that one of your parents had died or something had happened, and you try to remember that and you try to process that, you cannot remember clearly. You can't remember colors. You can't remember what was said. We had a situation in our family maybe 10 years ago where we had an elderly relative who set the house on fire while smoking, and she died in the fire. And the neighbors came to try to open the door to get her out, and she was already gone. But in talking to my older sister, the neighbor said, no, we never heard anything. The next day, my sister said to me, she was crying. She was crying out. They heard her crying. And I kept saying that didn't happen. But it's very, very hard to remember things clearly when you're in a crisis. And for those of you who want to watch a really gory YouTube video, there you go. It was a very, very tragic moment in our history. And John Kennedy was already dead by the time this happened. So what happens to your brain during a crisis is it goes into freeze, fight, or flight. We don't even get to choose that. We don't even get to decide which one we're going to do. But if I just give you an example of a car crash, if you're driving home and all of a sudden you see a car swerving at you, you have a reaction. What's your first thought? What do you think you're going to do? If the car is coming towards you, you have to process some way to get out of the car. You have to process some way to get away from what's happening. So if you freeze, you're going to think, well, this can't be happening, and you just don't move. If you're in fight mode, you might say, well, I'm going to stay right here and I'm going to speed up and get away from that guy, and then he's going to hit you, and there you go. Or you might think, wow, I better get out of the way here. And you swerve out of the path and you flee. So there's really three things that your brain activates when you have a crisis. And it either can be freeze, fight, or flight. You see a lot of people freezing at the moment of a crisis. You see a lot of people who just don't move. And then you have other people that have now begun to process the fight or flight, who are pushing those people along. It happens in accidents. It happens in some of the things that have happened in concerts where whatever his name was, Travis Scott, the concert that he had where the 8 people were trampled. There are other people that are in flight mode who are trying to push these people out of the way. These people are freezing, which is why they end up getting trampled. So you better hope that your brain gives you the right answer when this happens. This is the way we process a crisis, and we all do it. Sometimes if you practice enough, you can get to the right mode, but your thinking brain is going to shut down, and your sensory brain is going to take over. And going back to your teaching family model, you have kids that get triggered all the time. And once a kid is triggered by something that has happened, or something transpires in the cottage, and you have a kid that is blowing up and breaking windows and in full fight mode, the thinking brain is not there. The sensory brain has definitely taken over. And we all have this, and we're going to choose one of the three. I think a lot of you are kids, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and watching some of the kids on the Enterprise campus, triggering usually triggers a fight. It doesn't usually trigger a freeze, and it doesn't usually trigger a flight. It usually triggers a fight. And that's why so many of these situations are so difficult. It's also why before you had teaching family, And I don't know how you implement it. I really don't. I just remember when it came in. The model before was a very difficult model. It was the old level system. It was kind of based on punishment for bad behavior. It was sort of like the Alcatraz of interventions. And it was a very old model. I think it came in maybe the late 90s. And it was a model based on punishment. And it did not work. It was very difficult. Kids were constantly on what was called cottage restriction, or they weren't allowed to, if they blew up, if they fought, if they got into anything, the punishment was meant to teach them something, and very often it didn't. So a lot of the older models for controlling kids' behavior were really based on the freeze, fight, or flight. And they didn't take into account the fact that most children, when they're triggered, are going to fight. Okay, let's look at situational crises, because you've all been involved in them on some level. Almost everybody has had some kind of a loss. You don't get to be more than 10 without having some kind of a loss. There are very few people that have not experienced death. Very few people that haven't experienced some kind of difficulty. Incarcerations of family members, unfortunately, tend to run in some very difficult cultural circles. And mass shootings, everybody has been exposed to mass shootings at this point, haven't we? When I tried to find examples to use for you for some of these things, it was not hard, because there's so many that you can't remember from one end of the week to the next. So what is your role? If you look at yourself as the first responder, what is your role in a situational crisis? If you have a kid in front of you, or a staff person in front of you, or somebody that has gone through something and they are just not functioning, the first thing you're going to do is to try to make sure there's safety. Now, when your kids blow up, there often isn't safety. If they're breaking glass, if they're kicking over furniture, there's often not safety. You have to assess the risk for self-harm. You have to assess the client for safety. And you've got to look around and see, who do we have for social support here? Do we have other staff members that can come in and help me? When Mike Ellis died, one of the childcare staff came over to talk to me, and he was trying to tell me exactly what he remembered happening. And as it was probably a week after Mike died, I'm going to say, but when he was articulating his memory of what happened, he kept interspersing, what could I have done? Maybe if I had done something, he wouldn't have died. And if those of you who don't know anything about that particular incident, it's very unclear what happened to Mike. But he was hit in the back of the head during an altercation with a resident, and came into the office and went down. Died later that night, I think, in the hospital. But this particular staff member, his memory was, maybe I should have done something. Maybe I could have done something. Maybe there's something that I could have done to stop this event. The bottom line is that whether he had a stroke or whether he had traumatic brain injury, there was nothing the staff member could have done. But what he was definitely caught in that situational crisis of thinking, what am I should have done something. In that particular situation, what I did, and when we get into the whole critical incident stress debriefing, I made sure he was safe. I made sure the people around him were safe. He thought that he wasn't handling his 18-month-old baby very well. We talked about who else he could talk to after he left my office. And then I set him up with a full-time therapist. So what about a situational crisis involving a group of people, of which there are many, and I had so many to choose from? Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school shooting. For those of you who followed that at all, the Parkland shooting, that was a situation that happened. How long ago did it happen? think it happened in 2018. The sentencing trial for Nicholas Cruz went on for weeks. And during that, and it was on YouTube, it was on television all the time. It was publicized live. Those people who had lost their children in that shooting completely relived those events during their testimony. And it was very, very clear that they were right back there in 2018. They were right back there the day they found out that their kids had been killed. And when I watched it, I realized that there was a reason to let these people vent on Nicholas Cruz. They really wanted him to get the death penalty, which he did not get. And then when he didn't get the death penalty, the judge allowed them all to come up and go through it all over again, which from a therapist standpoint, from a clinician standpoint, I thought it was really, really difficult for those people. And somehow they felt like they needed to do it. But watching group grief process during Marjorie Stoneman Douglas will teach you a lot about situational crisis. The Las Vegas concert mass shooting, 58 people were killed. It's one of the mass shootings that we've never been able to figure out. We've never been able to figure out what that particular individual's motive was, because in most of the mass shootings, there's a profile, he didn't fit it. He was an older guy. He didn't put anything on social media that said he was going to do it the way is common now. And he just killed 58 people. But if you look at footage of that, you see different people in freeze, fight, or flight mode. You see some people pushing other people and trying to get them away. You see some people that were photographed just sitting frozen on the ground, because everybody goes through this at the same time. The Surfside Heights condo collapse was a very difficult situation for the first responders, because one of the first responders actually found his child in the rubble. Those first responders, very quick to say that they had a tremendous PTSD after this incident. And the reason I want to say to you that you have to consider all of you first responders is that we have only begun to recognize how difficult life is for first responders after the event. There are members of the Capitol Police who 2 years after the January 6th riots have been unable to go back to work. There are police officers from the Pulse shooting, which at this point was 5 years ago, who have been unable, maybe longer, who completely unable to go back to work. So if you have a bad incident on your campus or in your life, and you are feeling like I am not functioning on all burners, it's okay to say that, because we are just beginning to recognize that we need to pay a whole lot more attention to the first responders who are taking care of everybody else. And that's why I do say I consider all of you first responders. Micah, did I see you come in?
You did. I'm sorry. I have been at the school for a meeting.
So I heard. That's okay.
Hey, Barbara, as you say that, I was just contemplating. You see us, or you see our cottage staff as first responders. How do we grow that perception among our leadership so that they see what our staff work in on a day-to-day basis?
Well, if I had the answer to that, I would have proposed it many years ago. However, I will just say that, and Micah's question is very well put. I don't think that there is a lot of perception either among the upper leadership, certainly not among the board members, of what this line staff go through every single day. And the reason that this training, actually, I've had to update it several times, because the first time I did it was on the main campus, and it was after Newtown. And we were just talking about what would you do if you had a crisis like this. And one of the therapists came up to me and said, I don't know what I would do. So as a result, we came up with several scenarios and had people break into groups and say, how would you handle this? And one of the scenarios, oddly enough, was a bombing at the Boston Marathon. And that was before that actually happened. So, but even at the time, Micah, I remember trying to say to, it was Mindy Chamberlain was the vice president at the time, or Mindy Chambers, shouldn't you be doing something for these people that are going through this day after day and yet having to go in and work? The young man that came over to talk to me after Mike Ellis died, I had to get him out of the cottage. I had to call over there and say, look, you got a guy who's trying to work right now and trying to take care of kids, who's in absolutely no shape to do it. And actually it was Kevin who was able to say, call over there and say, would you let him out and let him come over? And in fact, lobbied for him to have a week off with pay after that happened, because he wasn't functioning. And he said he wasn't functioning. He said, I can't make decisions for other kids when I just keep seeing Mike falling down in the office. So if anybody has has any ideas, I don't know how successful I have been trying to say that. I tried to get the upper leadership to let me do a critical incident stress debriefing after those two kids escaped. And it wasn't, I mean, they didn't end up killing the policeman. They didn't end up getting killed themselves, but Channel 9 sat outside the gates of the main campus for days. And every time somebody tried to drive in or out, I mean, they were on public property, so they couldn't tell them to go, but it was tremendously stressful for people. They felt like, I think they felt like they were caged, and it was very stressful. Do I think that everybody recognizes that? I do not at all. I'm going to show you a little clip, and the only reason I'm showing this was the day of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting. This was the day of the Parkland shooting. And this is not a local newscaster. This guy's from Australia. People in other countries do not understand why our country has all these mass shootings. They sent a reporter over from Sydney to report in Parkland after this happened, because most other countries don't understand what's happened to our country. So you get his cute little Australian accent on top of it.
He's a teenager described as absolutely pure evil. Nicholas Cruz planned to inflict maximum damage at his former high school in Parkland, Florida, setting off a fire alarm to flush children out into the corridors where he began to shoot. Tonight, 17 people are confirmed dead and more than a dozen injured.
From inside a classroom, the sound of mass murder.
You run up and down the hallway, just banging and shooting into the classrooms. I just saw blood everywhere.
Desks used as shields as students frantically texted their parents. SWAT teams moving from room to room. Those who chose to run sprinted with their hands up, already trained on how to deal with this kind of emergency. Outside, helicopters, army tanks, and a parking lot triage, a war zone at Stoneman Douglas High School next to a giant pile of backpacks.
We can't get to her. We can't get a hold of her.
Have you called and you texted, nothing has come back?
Her boyfriend got shot. We heard.
This girl watched her teacher get shot.
We saw his body for like 30 minutes. We were just like praying and crying.
Dead bodies around the floor and blood all around the floor.
This teacher saved 19 students, pulling them into her classroom.
We sort of huddled, in the corner for a few minutes. And then I made the decision to move everyone to the closet.
It was around 2:30 when the rampage began. The gunman stormed the building wearing a gas mask and carrying smoke grenades. He set off the fire alarm to force students into the halls where he was waiting for them.
I popped as I started to bring up
It was a full hour before the gunman was arrested and taken to hospital, and it was someone they all knew. Nicholas Cruz, 19, a former student expelled last year for behavioural problems. Teachers claim he was troubled and had been identified as a potential shooter.
We a lot of kids do jokes around like that, saying that he's the one who stood up at school.
Officials say he used an AR-15 rifle and had countless magazines. His Instagram profile showing he was obsessed with guns. Cruz chose February 14th to carry out what is now the country's 18th school shooting just this year. A Valentine's Day massacre that never should have happened.
I'm tired of praying. America, you're killing your kids. What are we going to do about this?
9 News correspondent Lizzie Pearl is in Parkland, Florida this evening for us. Lizzie, what more do we know about Cruz?
Yeah, good evening to you, people. The shooter is still being questioned as we speak. Investigators want to know all about his motive, as well as the level of planning that went into this mass shooting. They are scouring his digital footprint, also looking at his social media posts, which have so far been described as very, very disturbing. Schoolmates of Nicholas Cruz have described him as a loner. Chillingly, many of them predicted that one day he may do something like this. And we will find out a whole lot more when he faces court tomorrow. The US President Donald Trump has offered his condolences to the victims and their families, but he has stopped short of bringing up gun control. Pete.
Okay, Lizzie, thank you.
Okay, I know I've seen this video 25 times, but what did you hear those kids, when those kids were processing what happened? What did they say?
Some of them already had signs that it was going to happen before it happened.
That is one of the things that we have learned about school shooters, is that they have a profile and they always put something on social media to say what they're going to do. It's called leakage. They let it be known that they're going to do this. But, you know, unfortunately, reporters are what reporters are, and they're always there after these situations, and they're always in the face of these kids that are clearly in shock. So as you heard them describing what happened, what were they describing? Because a couple of them said the same thing. What did they see?
Bodies.
What?
Dead bodies.
Yeah. They remembered seeing dead bodies, whether or not they were dead. They saw bodies, and they saw a lot of what? Blood. Blood always gets mentioned. Why does blood always get mentioned? For one thing, if you cut your finger, you can get a lot of blood from just a little cut finger. But if you have 17 people that are dead, there's going to be a lot of blood. And a lot of what people process when they're remembering what happened is what they saw. And what they saw blood. The other kid said dead bodies everywhere. The girl said, I heard popping. It's always sensory memories. I heard popping and I said, this is not a normal drill. And you heard the kind of, thankfully, there's not much of that footage in there, the footage of because the kids immediately got their cell phones out, and you heard the screaming, you heard the utter terror in these kids as they began to realize that something was happening. I can't, maybe someday I'll be able to, but I cannot listen to the audio footage from Uvalde, because Uvalde was one school shooting that didn't have to happen. And when you listen to those poor, very young children trying to call 911 and not getting any help, it's a really hard thing to process. But I think that what I only want you to get out of this, besides the fact that the Australians think we're totally crazy, is that these kids process this crisis through sensory memory. They saw blood, they smelled blood, they saw dead bodies, they heard popping, they saw their teacher. What did she say? We saw our teacher being killed. And then they had to watch him because they couldn't get to him for 30 minutes. So there's a lot of what you see and what you hear is sensory. So on that cheerful note, we'll move along.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Don't ever get an Apple Watch. It talks to you at the weirdest times.
Apple.com should be able to answer that question.
I'm not talking to you. I've got an Echo on my desk. I've got this and I've got Siri. So sometimes I'm not alone in the room anymore. There's just way too many things that talk to me. Okay. If we look at large scale crises, this is a picture from Newtown. I don't use a lot of pictures from Newtown either because they're difficult, but Newtown was the first shooting that involved very young children. And again, it's typical profile. This was a kid who had mental health issues. He killed his mother before he got to Newtown. But at this point in time, we didn't have the drills that you're seeing in Parkland. You saw those kids running out with their hands up. They knew the drill. They knew that when they saw the SWAT team come in, that they should put their hands up. Sadly, we have trained our children in how to deal with this kind of a large scale crisis. But at the stage of Newtown, we didn't have any of that. It was unconscionable for us to think that somebody would come in and shoot kindergartners, but that is what happened. So if you look at this picture, when I say everybody in the group may be processing things differently, look at this little girl. This little girl in the middle is absolutely terrified. And look at these two little boys. Now I realize that boys and girls are different, but look at these two little boys. Do they look scared? They kind of just look a little dingy. They kind of look like, oh, I don't know what's going on here. She's telling me to move. This kid here does not look anywhere near as scared as this little girl. This little girl clearly knows that something awful has happened. And these two little boys are completely out of it. You can't see in this whole picture, this is a teacher who is getting them out of the school and trying to move them along, who has calmed down enough to recognize that she's got to get them to flee. We hadn't trained our teachers for any of this. We hadn't trained our helping professionals to deal with any of this at this point. So what we see and what you see in large scale crises is that somebody usually pulls it together enough to say, let me see if I can take charge of this. In this case, it was this young woman in the parka. When we look at first responders have got to be, they've got to come on the scene and they've got to assess for safety and think about any situation in which you would consider yourself a first responder. Sometimes we don't know what's happened. Sometimes you walk into a cottage and you see broken glass and you see the furniture overturned and you just don't know what's happened. Most of our first responders have walked into these situations with very little information. And we are really just beginning to see that we haven't treated them very well. This guy here was on the right. This was a fireman, was taken after 9/11. The people from 9/11, not only did they suffer from severe post-traumatic stress, a lot of them have died in the intervening years because of all of the illnesses from sifting through that debris for days and days and days. But these were New York City policemen and firemen. And if any city could have handled 9/11, not that it deserved it, it would be New York City, because New York City people are tough people. And the people that work in the helping professions are very tough people. And they just got in there and did what they had to do. They had absolutely no idea what was going on. If you're old enough to remember 9/11, nobody knew what was going on. The first plane that hit that tower, we all assumed it was an accident. And then we looked up because by now the cameras were on the towers and watched the second plane plow right into the towers. And then everybody knew it was not an accident. But what had happened, who had done it, nobody knew anything at that point. And nobody expected the towers to come down. And we did not recognize the damage that was inflicted on those first responders at the time. And we have to recognize it now. And if I personalize that to you guys, recognize it for yourselves. if you're going through some tough stuff, recognize it for yourselves. Micah said, how can we get the leadership to recognize it? I don't know, but you can certainly recognize it for your group. Because if you've got one thing going for you up there, that you are not on the main campus. So you can do what needs to be done for your people and your group, your kids and your team, without trying to convince anybody else to do it. I sometimes, and I know I've said this to Micah a lot of times, I have done a lot of things over here since the acquisition in 2019 that I don't tell anybody about. I don't ask permission to do it. I do what I think is right for my people. That 3 miles between us and main campus might as well be 3,000 miles. We're entirely separate, and if I need to do something or I feel something needs to be done for one of my staff that's gone through a hard time, or something that has happened that we all need to get together as therapists and support each other, and just do it. And I kind of suggest the same thing for you guys. Actually, I'm going to show this just a real quick video because it does talk about when we finally began to figure out that first responders needed help.
The Pulse tragedy really shined a light on something that first responders have to deal with often, certainly in situations like this, PTSD, and it's something they really never talk about.
Absolutely right. And in fact, the wife of an Orlando police officer has really been at the forefront of this fight, trying to push state lawmakers to really recognize this as an illness that should be handled with dignity and, of course, some financial support. News 6 investigator Mike Polfeld joins us now with more on that effort. Mike?
Thanks, Lisa. Good evening, everyone. Listen, this is an important story to the entire community. Jessica Reeland's push for a state law to assist first responders actually diagnosed with PTSD fell short in Tallahassee. I don't know if you heard about that, but it fell short this session. But then a friend from Capitol Hill stepped in, and this issue is taking center stage.
It felt as though it wouldn't be turned down. We just ran out of time.
It's been a personal journey. Her husband, Jerry, was one of the first responders assigned to remove the dead from Pulse nightclub. He shared this hand-drawn sketch of the scene he recalled following Omar Mateen's vicious assault.
I could have never trained for that. I mean, I've seen homicides and suicides before, dealt with it, but not like that.
Monday, April 17th, she traveled to Tallahassee with several other first responder families, all sharing stories of their loved ones' painful struggles with PTSD.
So that day, my husband left. And since that day, my husband hasn't come home.
The testimony was powerful. The committee approved it unanimously, but it never made it to the floor for a full vote. A few weeks later, at a town hall meeting in Apopka, Reeland presented her PTSD fight to Congresswoman Val Demings. The former Orlando Police Department chief understood the Pulse legacy and told Reeland something could be done on Capitol Hill. Enter the Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Act of 2017, in part mandating states and local law enforcement agencies to establish peer mentoring mental health and wellness pilot programs, which would include treatment of PTSD.
Well, it's so important to take care of the ones who take care of us.
It passed the Senate May 16th. Now it's up to the House. Val Demings is one of 20 co-sponsors of that measure.
Out of the ashes, good things can come, and I couldn't be prouder of the place I call
home. And Representative Demings tells me.
Sorry, I went backwards on you. I think we have vastly underestimated the damage that we do to people that do first responding. The Pulse situation, how many people were killed at Pulse? It's like 50, I forget, it's 50 something. But there's more video of that particular police officer, and he talked about having to get in there. This was after it was all over, and try to get the bodies out. And there was so much blood, and they all kept slipping in the blood. And the smell of the blood and the smell, he kept saying it smelled like death. A lot of people, when you do critical incident stress debriefings with first responders, these are tough people. These are not people that are used to asking for help. And a lot of what they talk about is what they smelled, what they saw, what they heard. It's a little bit easier to talk about that than to say, I was so scared, I just didn't know what to do. Look at the testimony of the Capitol Police. The Capitol Police who have testified in front of Congress, not only did they get no support from the people they were trying to save, but I mean, they've had very little support since that has happened. When you have members of Congress, regardless of what side of the aisle you sit on, saying that was just a tourist event, that was just a public relations stunt, when 5 people died. So it's no surprise that some of these people have not been able to go back to work. So when we are looking at the first phase of crisis intervention, that teacher in the new town emerged as the leader. She was the one who finally said, let's get these kids out of the school. And again, remember, we had no training for this at that point. She was just the one who said, okay, I think I know what to do. She was the one that was able to calm down enough to begin to get the kids out of the school. And as she was able to do that, then other teachers, if you look at that picture again, there's another teacher on the other side who is now kind of following her lead and able to take over. Most first responders are trained to assess the immediate needs, and they have to look for safety. You would have to do the same thing. If you have a situation with one of your kids or some of your kids really blowing up, causing some kind of damage, causing some kind of safety issue, breaking glass, whatever, you've got to assess how to get everybody else safe, and you've got to make sure that you're safe yourself. Because if you're not safe, it doesn't do anybody any good. And the second phase is helping people move past that freeze, fight, or flight. As we get into the steps of critical incident, one of the most stabilizing things you can do is just help people talk about what happened. And you don't have to be a therapist to do it. You don't have to be a therapist to just sit and listen to somebody. And sometimes just allowing somebody to say, this is what happened and this is what I saw, might help this person move into a safe plan for coping. We as trained therapists say, okay, you know, we're going to help them tell the story, but very often the story isn't what happened. Very often the story is what they remember seeing, what they remember hearing. And you can get some pretty distorted memories from some of that stuff. And again, crisis intervention isn't therapy. You don't need to be a therapist to do this, which is why when we did this training on the Enterprise campus, one of the things that I think what I saw were the childcare workers saying, I never thought of myself as the first responder. Well, you have to handle crises all the time. I mean, teaching family doesn't resolve everything, does it? Certainly doesn't resolve it when a kid is up on the ceiling. I know it resolves a lot, but it doesn't solve every crisis. I think, Micah, before you came in, I think you had not come in, we were talking about the old level system. And the old level system, I believe, came in 1998, because that's when I moved there from Massachusetts, and they were just setting it up then. And the childcare staff absolutely hated it. And there were the 2 psychologists that developed the level system. It was a couple of women, and they would come to these meetings, and I was new to function. I was new to Florida and the whole thing. And these childcare workers kept saying, you cannot do this to these kids. You can't approach them with negativity. You can't approach them with punishment. That is not going to work. And as often happens, the person with the most initials after their name gets the vote. And they were shouted down. And I remember thinking they're absolutely right. And they're the ones that are in the cottages with these kids. And they're absolutely right about what effect that was going to have on these kids. And when I think about it, it's almost embarrassing
for me to think about some of the stuff I saw happen to kids. I'm not telling tales out of school because I've said this before, but there is a closet in Waller Jeter that has roof carpeting on the walls. And the reason it's there is that it's the room that they used to lock the kids in and make them sit there until they stop screaming. It was like something out of a Dickens novel. And did it work? Absolutely not. They were supposed to sit there for 15 minutes and not yell. And when you have now picked up a kid and physically carried him into a room and shut the door and locked it, do you think that kid's going to calm down? It was insane. And actually it was DCF that finally made them do it. And I'm not saying that to criticize the children's home. What I'm trying to say is that the thinking at the time allowed that to happen. A lot has changed in our field, but it's almost, I can't believe that in 1998, that kind of thinking was allowed to go on, that we were allowed to do that to children. And I think of some of the damage we probably did to some of those kids. So one of the first nights I saw this implemented, it was one of my kids that I was working with in therapy. And I went over because they called me and said that they had put him into this lockup. And I got in there and I could hear him screaming my name. And they said, you're not supposed to say anything. You can't say anything. Well, I'd only been here for a couple of weeks. And I remember getting home and saying to my husband, I can't believe I just witnessed that. Now, believe it or not, I stayed there for another 2 years after that, but it was just one of the examples of how much our field has progressed. So if you have heartache with the teaching family model, welcome to the old level system. It's certainly infinitely better than what you had. So, okay. Let's look at the NOVA model. This is a specific model of critical incident stress debriefing. It was designed back in the 80s. It was designed for group intervention for first responders. I'm sorry, it was developed in the 70s. But there's a lot of different models for critical incident stress debriefing. The NOVA model is just the most frequently used. And I trained in this model. Well, it was right before 9/11 because I went to a week-long crisis intervention training with the Sanford law enforcement. I don't know what I was doing there, but I was there, and I was there for a week. And the trainer did a critical incident stress debriefing as a model. She wanted to show the law enforcement how they could use it, and she explained what the purpose of it. And then she said, and we're going to have everybody in your unit get in a circle and we're going to do the critical incident stress debriefing. I didn't think they'd say anything. Oh my God, they spilled their guts. It was unbelievable. But she was very, very good. And these were cops who didn't realize, I think, how much stress they were under at the time. But it was interesting. There are three main tenets of any NOVA model, and this is the three main tenets of any situation in which you want to calm people down, allow them to process their trauma, and allow them to figure out where they need to go from here. So it doesn't have to be the NOVA model. It doesn't have to be any critical incident stress debriefing model. It just has to contain these three things. It has to contain safety and security, ventilate and validate, and prepare and predict. When I went through this training, they handed me a little laminated business card that I kept in my wallet for years that said safety and security, ventilate and validate, and prepare and predict. Those are the three main tenets of doing this. And all that means is that say you've got a group, you've had something's bad has happened on Madison, you're all going to get together and Micah's going to run this critical incident stress debriefing. The first thing you have to know is, does everybody in your group feel safe enough to do this? Because not everybody is feeling safe after something has happened. But you have to assure the people in your group that they are going to be safe, that if they feel like they need to get up and leave, they can do that. You can watch any of these models on YouTube. You can watch people setting up critical incident stress debriefings. But assuring people that they're safe. you can say to your group, it's okay if you want to get up and leave, just don't leave the building. And somebody will be outside, and if you need to talk to somebody, there'll always be somebody there, but you have to let people feel safe. And you have to let people begin to process their memories of the immediate event. And then you've got to say, this is what's going to happen. You're probably going to have some PTSD symptoms. You're probably going to have nightmares. You're probably going to be having a hard time sleeping. Let's prepare and predict for that. Let's see if we can get you some ongoing support. So safety, ventilation, and predicting are the three things that you're going to have happen. When Justin Hagel died, Justin Hagel was a very young man. He was 24 years old. He and his wife worked at the children's home. They had a 2-month-old baby. And it was an accident. It was plain and simple. It was just an accident. He was on a skateboard. He didn't have a helmet on. And when he hit the bump and went up, he came down on his head. One of the things that I saw when I just kind of fell into doing this with this group, because I just felt that they needed the support of knowing that they could talk about this a little bit. It didn't seem to me like there had been a lot of immediate response to the other childcare staff at the time. But as we began to talk, some of their memories of what happened were distorted. I remember one of them saying, you know what, Justin came out, it happened on a Sunday afternoon. Justin came out of chapel this morning and said something about, I just want to be with him. And from that, this individual deduced that Justin had committed suicide. So there was kind of some distortion around that. And there was some memory distortion around the fact that there was memory distortion. There was also anger at Justin from his coworkers that he didn't have a helmet on. Now, we all know that you make the kids put helmets on before they get on skateboards or bikes. So why didn't he have a helmet on? Well, he was 24 years old. Do people expect to die when they're 24 years old? They don't. And I don't know how old anybody in this room is, but you do have a sense of invincibility when you are very young. Did Justin want to kill himself? No, he didn't. He had a 2-month-old baby. He had a wife that he loved very much. But what I saw this group doing, and truthfully, I did it for 3 weeks. By the end of the 3 weeks, I said, okay, I think we're ready to move on. We're ready to get back into training, because I think we've now shared with our group that we are angry with Justin for dying. We're terribly sad the fact that he died. We remember the things that he said right at the end. We remember the fact that the kids had to call 911. He had his cottage kids with him, and they had to call 911, and they had to use a phone that they had filched in order to do it. But those kids also needed a lot of incident stress debriefing. They were with him when he died. Did any of that happen? No, it didn't. But I didn't go past this with them until I felt like they were ready to go. And I didn't ask anybody. I didn't work at the children's home then. I was there as a trainer. I just said, I think this is what you guys need, and this is what we're going to do. So again, these are the 3 tenets, and they're in all the models. All of the models say assess for safety, allow the client to describe what happened without judgment, and then prepare the client for what's going to happen going forward. It isn't a hard model. It's not therapy. And like I said, you don't need to need to have 4 initials after your name to get your group together, calm them down, let them feel like they are safe within the safety of your group, and that you're going to tell them what's probably going to happen. Because prediction is a big part of this. If you leave a critical incident stress debriefing and just say, okay, everything's fine now, I'm going to be okay. It isn't. And predicting those kinds of symptoms is very helpful, because then when they happen, you're not sitting there thinking, I must be crazy.
Why am I still dreaming about this? Why am I still thinking about this? Because it's very, very normal after a situation like that. When we do the formal models, we have a safety monitor outside, and we always tell the people in the group that there will be a safety monitor outside, and if you do need to leave, it's fine, and if you want to talk to them, you can, and if you don't have to. All we ask you to do is to not leave the building, because once you allow somebody to leave the building, they have left the confines of the safety of that structure. So you really need to try to keep people in the room, in the building. The group of police officers, the reason I said that they kind of got into this is that I don't think the moderator or the trainer knew that this had happened. She thought she was just going to model a critical incident stress debriefing with a bunch of cops who typically wouldn't engage at all. But one of their force had been killed the week before. He'd been killed in the line of duty. And policemen all tend to marry each other, and fathers and sons, etc. So because of this, everybody in the room was somehow related to this guy. And what they were able to talk about was the fact that they kept trying to call him. They all said the same thing. They kept trying to call him on his whatever his radio was, and they couldn't hear anything because he was already shot. And they talked about the silence. We all kept calling him. We all kept trying to call the monitor, and all we could hear was silence. And he didn't have it turned down because he was already gone. But what they talked about was that. And at several points, each one of them would get up and leave and kind of calm down, talk to the safety monitor, come back in, and then try to support the people around them. And I only tell you this story that if you have law enforcement people in your family, you know that they're a very well-defended lot. And for them to be able to use this model and to use it to support each other and to deal with their own grief about this was a pretty remarkable thing to watch. If you're going to do this, if you're going to be the moderator, if you want to call it that, just tell everybody what you're going to do. With the Justin Hagel situation, I was there to do a training. That was why I was there that day. And when they came in and I looked at all of them, I thought, well, I might as well save my wind. They're not going to be able to do the training. And I said, okay, this is what we're going to do. And you can talk or not talk, but I want you to feel safe. And Larry Smith, who sadly I gathered just passed away a few weeks ago, was a child care worker there at the time. And he said, wait a minute. And he said, if people are going to cry, I want to help you. And he got up and went into the bathroom and got miles and miles of paper towel and toilet paper and handed it to everybody around the room. And I thought it was just a very sweet way of one staff member trying to support everybody else in the only way he knew how. But I told them what was going to happen. I told them how we were going to proceed and that we would know when we were ready to let it go. And it's kind of helpful to do that because you want people to know that you have a purpose in doing this and that you know exactly what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So just telling people what you're going to do is important. And it's a big part of that model. And then you're going to let people access their memories however they want to. The typical way to begin is to say, when this happened, what did you hear? What did you see? What did you smell? Because sensory memories are a little bit easier to pull out than how you felt. You think a bunch of cops are going to sit around and say, I was scared to death when I couldn't get him to pick up his radio? They didn't say they were scared to death. They kept talking about the silence. There was no noise coming from that radio. And that was easier for them. When you saw the policeman who said he'd gone in to do the pulse. Did you happen to catch the thing that he had drawn on the side? He had a piece of yellow pad paper that he had drawn all what he remembered in his memory of where all these people were and whether or not they were dead or injured. And he had them all color coded because, now was that exactly, how could he have captured that? He probably didn't. But in your mind, you do a snapshot in your mind of something that's happened. And that's what he did. He had a snapshot and he drew it. And he drew where all these, drew dots for where he remembered the injured and the dead and the dying being. Now, how did that probably help him? He wasn't going to say he was scared. He was trying to say, this is what I remember. It's sometimes easier to do that. And it's easier for us to do it because it's like people saying, I think that maybe Justin forgot his helmet. Maybe he didn't want his helmet because he wanted to die. Maybe he said he wanted to be with him because he was really contemplating suicide. And I remember him saying that. I heard him say that clearly. Is that what he meant? It just allowed people to kind of meander through an unexplainable incident without being able to say, I am just really, I cannot believe that this 24-year-old young man is dead.
Hey, Barbara, as you talk through this, I think there are times in residential care where kids, though, begin to share their own traumatic history casually in the cottage with staff, and it's uncomfortable because some of it is just as ugly as if there were bodies or blood or whatever. And the easy thing to do is to say, talk about that with, on this campus, Miss Alexis, or we would, in Macon, we would say, well, share that with your therapist.
Right.
Is that an appropriate response to keep both people safe, emotionally safe, or what do you suggest in those situations?
You know, it's funny that you asked that. I just did a training last night for the foster parents in Volusia County, the pumped foster parents, and that came up. And you know, I mean, Alexa, you're right there, so that's fine. They can chase you down and drag you in and let you take your 4 initials and use them, but that isn't always the case. Foster parents don't have that accessibility. And one of them said, you know, if I have kids trying to tell me something, I want to respond, but is it okay for me to respond? Well, think about the opposite. What if you don't? What if you have a kid who's, you know, when do they talk to you? They talk to you when they're tired. They talk to you when they're going to bed. They talk to you when maybe you're trying to do some kind of a caretaking event from them, like doing their hair or whatever. But if you say, well, why don't you talk to your therapist about that? Doesn't that seem like it would be, I don't really care what you said. And I know that it's hard for foster parents, and I know that it's hard for anybody to absorb the stories that these kids tell, because kids also tell stories based on what they remember sensorily. They talk about what they saw, what they heard, what they felt, what they smelled, and that's how they paint that memory. But if you don't say, I'm really sorry that that happened to you and you didn't deserve it, and I'm going to do what I can to make you feel safe, and I'm really glad you told me. You don't have to get every detail, but isn't that a better message? Isn't that a better message of, I'm really glad that you were able to tell me that, and I really wish that that had not happened to you. I think that's such a better message, because I know that a lot of people just say, why don't you wait and talk to your therapist about that? When's your appointment? Oh, 3 days from now at 1 o'clock. Okay, fine. Hold that thought. You don't want to do that to them. And I don't think you're overstepping your bounds. I mean, I don't think you have to say, sit down and say, sit down and tell me about what happened, kid. But you certainly want to respond with caring and with kindness and with some kind of prediction of support. So yeah, if you want to tag the therapist in at that point, you can. But Micah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we have to find a way to validate it, but I also think that we have to individualize it. There are some kids that we have that use whatever audience they have to share things in whatever way that I don't want to say attention seeking, but sometimes it is attention seeking. And then there are others that are truly in a crisis that need to talk through it. I think it depends on where you are with the kid.
Yeah, I agree. And you know, it always struck me as odd is that we would say kids are attention seeking. Why shouldn't they seek attention? You know, I mean, is it always helpful? Is our response important if we think that this is coming from a need for attention? Yeah, the response is important. I think you just always want to respond with some kind of kindness and compassion, because you never know where that need to reveal that memory is coming from. I think it's a tough call. It certainly got a lot of attention from the foster parents last night, because, and again, you know, you guys all have each other. And my sense is that you're a really good group and you support each other, but I also got such a, I'm sorry? I didn't hear what you said.
And with the phone, but we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Foster parents are kind of, they're alone. I mean, they don't have anybody, they don't have a team. And that was kind of the point that they all kept making with me last night, is that when this stuff happens, or when kids say something, and that they clearly wanted to do the right thing. But in the moment, you can't time when somebody's going to suddenly drop something on you. Whether you're making dinner or whether you're trying to put them to bed or whatever, that you've got to be able to react in the moment. So we did talk quite a lot about that, and about them. I said, you don't have to sit down and grill them, because you know that Florida has the 3 interview rule. But you do want them to know that you cared, that it isn't their fault, that you're going to do something to help them if you can. So I don't think you can go wrong with that response, really. Okay, just a little bit about the 9/11. When we are doing memories, we have to remember that sensory memories can be very distorted memories. So the policeman who was talking about the blood and about slipping in the blood probably was slipping in the blood. Sometimes when you get some of these memories, they are distorted. If you remember anything about 9/11, certainly that was sensory overload. When those towers came down, the amount of dust and debris on the streets was overwhelming. And you saw pictures of people who were just running to get away from it, were covered with dust and ash. And that's what they remembered. They remembered the smell. They remembered the sounds of the towers collapsing. But in some of the critical incident stress debriefings, some of these people thought that they heard people crying out from the towers. It would have been highly unlikely that they would have actually heard anybody crying out from the towers, but some people thought they did. Now that's probably a distorted memory, because those visions of those people who jumped out and fell to get away from the flames was pretty profound at the time. And again, did those people jump out the windows because they wanted to die? That was flight. They were going to burn. They jumped out the windows. They knew they were going to die, but their response was flight. A lot of people have very distorted memories after 9/11. Part of the reason for that is the media. The media played those pictures of the people falling out the windows over and over and over again, to the point where parents were told to turn the television off because young children thought that the sky was raining people. It was a pretty sensorily disturbing image. If you have a good group, go ahead. I can hear somebody saying something, but I don't know if you're talking to me.
Barbara, something must be going on. It sounds like when you hear something, you go really quiet here. Should we get out and call back?
Is it your microphone?
Do what now?
Is it your microphone? Because I'm getting kickback.
We're not saying anything.
We're not saying anything.
Why don't you get out and come back in again?
Yeah, let me hang up. I'll call back in.
Okay. Are you back in?
Yeah, we're back in. That sounds much better, doesn't it?
It might be your microphone.
Okay. Well, it sounds 100% better now.
Okay, we're kind of closing in on this anyway, so allow your group to assist in the process too, because a lot of times once a group has a common purpose, because you're all in the same shared trauma. So you'll often find that you as the person running this don't have to do anything, because a lot of times the other people in the group will say, I don't think that happened. When I was doing this with the Enterprise campus, the whole bugaboo of whether or not Justin had for some reason decided to abandon his wife and child and kill himself was completely irrational. It made absolutely no sense. This kid died in an accident, but I didn't say anything. The other members of the group were really kind of the ones that came around and said, I think you're really just trying to make sense out of something that doesn't make any sense. And that was more effective than me trying to say, I don't think that happened. So you will often find that other members of the group, I mean, remember, you're all in this for the same thing. So you'll find that they will try to support you in this process. I'm going to just look real quick at some de-escalation techniques. And that's why I say you don't have to have 4 initials after your name. You've got to stay calm. If you're going to run any kind of a critical incident stress debriefing, conscious use of self is an old psychotherapy term. And really what it means is that you have to be aware of the way you look if you are running a group, your posture, the way you hold yourself, your tone of voice, the level of voice. And I say this because, you know, I've been a therapist most of my adult life, and it's just a muscle that you learn how to flex after a while, that you try to always keep your voice, your face. You're always trying to be respectful. You're always trying to, I used to call it my concerned therapy face. When somebody would come in and say something to me and I would give them the concerned therapy face. But I always make eye contact. I haven't done direct service in a couple of years now since I've been running Circle of Friends, but
when I watch other therapists, I'll say the same thing to them. You must model calm. You must always make eye contact. You must be respectful of the things that people say. I would have to say, actors call it breaking. When an actor loses control, when they're trying to give a line and they laugh or they lose control. I can remember some of the Fumsh kids made me break, because when I first got there, the stories that they told me were so different, not worse, but different than what I heard in Massachusetts. Culturally, they were different. And some of the use of corporal punishment, it was a lot more accessible in the Deep South in the 90s than perhaps it is now. And some of the things that these kids would tell me, I would really have to kind of hold my hand over my face so that I wouldn't go, what? And I hadn't had to do that for a long time. So just if you're calm, you'll keep the people in your group calm. And that seems like a simple thing to do, but sometimes it isn't. We talk about active and reflective listening. Active listening just means that you let people speak and you pay attention and you don't interrupt, because it isn't what you're thinking. It's not what you're remembering. It's what they're remembering. And reflective listening is just saying, so what I'm hearing you say is what? Or just help me to understand a little bit more about that. What you never, ever, ever want to say if you are in a group or you're running a group is, why are you feeling like that? You don't ever want to start a sentence with why. Even in your own life, who is famous for why sentences? Your mother. Your mother would say, why are you doing that? I don't understand. Why are you acting like this? And all why does is make us defensive. So if you are able to engage in active and reflective listening, you're just going to try to help people to clarify. I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. Can you say a little bit more about that? Can you explain a little bit more about that memory that you just told me? And you will find that people will tell you more if you don't start a sentence with why. It's not your best, not your best game. And again, we all did this. We all did this with our own kids. We would all say, I don't understand. Why are you upset after I've gotten done yelling at you for 10 minutes because you didn't get your homework done on time? So just try to remember reflective listening. Just try to remember to not start your sentences with why, and let people finish before you interrupt them. Top tools of the crisis intervener. You all have these things or you wouldn't be in this field. You're not accountants. You're here because you have empathy for the kids that you work with and for the people around you. And most of you are very good at reading nonverbal clues. In fact, when we would talk about a kid blowing up in a cottage after the fact, after it was all over, you would usually find that the child care staff who were involved at the time would, thinking back, recognize the nonverbal cues that the kid gave before they blew up. They would talk about, well, he was shaking his foot a lot, or he was twitching, or he was muttering under his breath, or he was acting scared. Sometimes the prelude to a blow up is the fear of not being safe. So if you are empathetic, if you know when to listen, if you know when to empower, and if you know when to predict that this is going to get better for you, but it may not get better until we put certain things in place for you. And very often that is the person with the 4 initials after their name, or very often it might be a few days off. It might be just having a little bit of time to yourself. We all, we talk about self-care. We talked about self-care all through the pandemic. Well, what did we all do for self-care then? Did we stop doing it now that the pandemic is over? We all have to know how to take care of ourselves. Actually, this portion I probably don't need to go over with you, because this is the portion that I use for the therapist.
And the reason I do the Ethan Crumbley case is because what happened with the Ethan Crumbley case is that the parents were charged. The parents are still they're still being held without bail, which seems incredible to me. It's been like a year and a half. They were the first parents to be charged as being complicit with a school shooter. And the only reason I put this in here was what happened, because this goes back to October of 21, that, and I'm just going to shoot through this a little quickly. This affected the therapeutic community greatly because the school guidance counselor who interviewed the Crumbley parents and who interviewed Ethan Crumbley did not search his backpack, and the parents did not take him home. These parents were asked to take him home and get him counseling, and they didn't do that. And the school guidance counselor sent Ethan back to class. Ethan went back to class, went into the bathroom, loaded up the gun, came out and shot 4 people. So the school guidance counselor was being blamed for this. He was brought in to testify. He was able to say, in the state that I live in, I am not allowed to look in a student's backpack unless there is a disciplinary issue, and there wasn't with him. But the testimony was televised nationally. It was a real scary thing for people like me that do this work, because this guy was not responsible for what Ethan Crumbley did, but he was on television. He was on the witness stand for several hours, and it was televised nationally. And he gave a master class in how to testify, but he was being blamed. And what we did at Circle of Friends was to make a decision that we were going to do something. So we put out a flyer, we put out an email. I did not expect to get this kind of response, by the way, but we put out our Thursday email, and we invited professionals to join us for a roundtable discussion about things that we learned from the Ethan Crumbley case. And it would just surprise me, because from the minute the Thursday email came out, our phones started ringing here. And I didn't even know most of these people. They were therapists, they had worked in other agencies, they were in private practice, they were school guidance counselors, they were from all kinds of agencies. We had this huge roundtable discussion, and it turned into a critical incident stress debriefing for the helping professionals. And why I say that is that I was trying to guide this discussion on Zoom with a whole bunch of people that I did not know. And it became very clear that the theme was that, are we going to start being blamed for not intervening before a school shooting? So, and the only reason I put this in here, and I do use it when I'm using this for therapists, is that we ended up discussing our professional safety. So we did safety and security. Are we safe? If we accept these clients, if we go into a home where there's an active school shooter, are we safe? And if we aren't safe, what do we have to put into place so that we will feel safe? If we're going to go into a school, what do we have to do to feel safe? And there were very practical things that came up in this. One of the CEO of another agency said, I tell my therapists that if they're going to go into the school, to get away from the door. And once you go in, get your name tag and then get away from the door. And if you're going to go to the back of the building, always know where the exits are. And that was his way of helping his people feel safe. He also said, I had a therapist. We always say, are there any guns in the home? Because everybody in Florida has got a gun. And are they secured? And therapist was given the affirmative. She got out to the house, and there was a whole rack of unsecured guns on the wall of the kitchen. And she called this CEO, and he said, leave. If you don't feel safe, just leave. So we talked about our professional safety, and there was a lot of ventilation of our frustration about being suddenly at the forefront of being blamed for something that we're supposed to be trying to help with. Kind of like the Capitol Police, who were there and risked their lives trying to take care of people, that some of whom then denied that this had ever happened. So, and I can understand their frustration. at that. So we discussed our safety, we ventilated our frustrations, and then we all came up with plans for our respective agencies on what we were going to do with active shooter cases. That was a year ago. That was last March. We have, at Circle of Friends, developed a whole protocol around how are we going to open these cases? What information do we need? How are we going to approach the families? And when do we back out if our safety is not ensured? So, and finally, we just said these cases aren't going away. So we've got to figure out a way to deal with them. We've got to figure out a way to keep ourselves safe as helping professionals and to keep our ethical boundaries so that we don't violate our ethical standards. So kind of an odd way of ending up doing a critical incident stress debriefing, but that's what happened. Because when people need to have a common safety net, they did. And we actually had a follow-up to that, and it went very well, but I didn't expect that to happen. We just kind of fell into it, and that's what happened. So finally, our last slide is for all of you. There's tremendous stress in being a crisis intervener. There's a tremendous stress in being a first responder. And you have to almost make these decisions on a daily basis with your kids. If you're in any kind of position with the rest of your teammates, you've got to be, if there's a bad situation, you got to be looking at your teammates to say, who here needs some help? Who here might really need to have some time to regain safety and be able to talk about what happened? That's a lot of stress. So I would just say, to go back to the whole self-care thing, what do you do to try to take care of yourselves after you've taken care of everybody else? Everybody's got something. You know, some people work out, some people do yoga, some people pray, some people drink wine. Everybody has their thing. So be aware of the fact that you deserve to do that if you are in a situation, and you are all the time, where you have to do any kind of crisis response. So, any other comments before we wrap up? Your sound is back, yes?
There aren't any comments. The sound is kind of acting up again, but
it's your microphone. It is your microphone, because we've had the same trouble. You have the same one we have, and it does that. So, all right, you guys, it's always a pleasure working with the Madison crowd.
Thank you.
All right, have a good one.